Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, I've been getting a lot of requests for me to take a look at Matt Walsh's video on the history of slavery in America. And took a look at I didn't watch the video, but I looked at the video on his channel, and it's like nearly an hour long. And I feel like that's just a lot to throw, not only at me, but for me to throw at all of you in one go. I did see that he's got clips, like various segments of it available. So I think that's what we're going to do, is from time to time take a look at some of these segments. I'm especially interested in seeing, he's got a video that I guess is behind a paywall on a subscription service about what he says is the real history of the Civil War. And from watching the trailer of that, it seems to be very heavily pro-Confederacy. So I'm actually really anxious for that to get released in some form to the public so we can take a look at that one. But in the meantime, I want to take a look at this specific 10-minute clip that he has, which is titled "The History of White Slaves in America." And I know some of my friends like Mr. Beat and Cynical Historian have taken a look at this, as have some others, and I haven't watched any of their videos, so I'm coming into this cold. I have no idea what Matt Walsh is going to say. I'm somewhat familiar with Matt Walsh and his politics, so I have a feeling I know where this is going, but as always, I just invite you to offer your thoughts, but I would ask you to do a couple of things, and I think this is just good advice in general for videos. First of all, watch the whole video before you comment. So often I get people who comment things based on the title or based on the first 2-3 minutes of a video that would have been addressed had they watched the entire thing, or that don't accurately reflect what the video ends up being about. So I think it's a great practice for us to get into in general, which is to listen and then offer comment. And I try to do that as much as I can, but sometimes I jump on things a little too quickly myself, so we're all guilty of that. But let's go ahead and dive into this one. The link's down in the description so you can check it out without my commentary. Here we go.
On the morning of June 14th, 1786, Captain James Moore's family woke up on what seemed to be a normal day in Southwest Virginia. But as they left the family's cabin to tend to their farm animals, the fearful war whoop was heard, and a raiding party of Ohio Valley Shawnee Indians rode down a ridgeline and attacked them. Captain Moore was shot 7 times before being tomahawked and scalped. The Indians then murdered 3 of his children, leaving only his family members who were locked inside the cabin. Much like the Barbary pirates, the Indians broke into the house, shot the dogs, plundered and burned the home, killed the livestock, and took Moore's wife and surviving children captive.
Yeah, and this is a story that gets repeated multiple times along the frontier. Kind of basically along the Appalachian Mountains is really where the frontier is for a lot of early American history. This story is repeated many times over in the West. And it does happen both ways. You have a lot of raiding parties. So here in Ohio, in Northeast Ohio, we have the Gnadenhutten Massacre, where peaceful Moravian Indians who hadn't attacked anybody, who weren't enslaving anybody, got attacked by a group of patriot militia and murdered men, women, and children. So this absolutely is a true part of history.
The raiding party stole horses and embarked on a journey to Detroit, which was then an open-air market for humans captured by Indians. To give you a sense of the savagery of the Indians, when one of the surviving sons, John, fell behind on the journey, an Indian split his head open with a tomahawk and then told John's mother what happened with her son's bloody scalp hanging in his waistband. They reached Detroit in December, where, in a drunken frolic, one of the surviving daughters, Mary Moore, was sold into slavery for a few gallons of rum to a man named Stogwell, who had been an active Tory during the war and had removed to Canada after it closed for fear of losing his life if he remained in the United States.
Yeah, but at that point, Canada had or was about to abolish slavery. It was actually John Graves Simcoe who did that, the guy who's the villain in Turn Washington Spies. He's the one who outlawed slavery in what was then called Upper Canada, which would be this on the map, the lower part.
3 years later, she was rescued by her brother and returned to the United States. Stories like Mary Moore's were common in the early frontier period in America, and often the stories became nationwide bestsellers. The vast majority of white slaves in the United States were owned by fellow whites. Somewhere between 60 and 70% of white immigrants to the American colonies arrived in bondage, often involuntarily. An estimated 150,000 arrived between 1620 and 1776.
Yeah, that's accurate. I don't know if I'd say it's as high as 60 or 70%, but it could be as many as 40, 50%. You know, it's semantics. We're talking about numbers. We're talking about indentured servants. So I don't know if I would agree that that a majority or many, you know, the vast majority of them were involuntary. Yes, there was involuntary instances that happened as a result of being punished for a crime, things like that. So you at least had some form of due process in most cases. But many of these people like signed contracts willingly. One of my ancestors who was on the Mayflower was an indentured servant. But it's important to note that, and listen, I'm going to probably have to say this multiple times during this video. I understand that what is being done here is trying to provide information that doesn't get talked about when we're talking about the history of slavery in America. But don't allow this information to, in your mind, in any way, shape, or form, think that what he's talking about is comparable to the chattel slavery system of Africans that were brought over. I'm not saying that that's what he's trying to do, but I can see how many people use this as an argument to say, well, there were white slaves too, and there were just as many of those kinds of things, to try and say that, well, it was just as bad as this other one that we talk about a whole lot, and that's just not the reality. These people were temporarily indentured. It was very rarely, if ever, a lifetime thing. It was usually like a 7-year thing. You had certain guarantees. You were still seen legally as a human being, which did not happen with African American slaves. You were not treated as property. You still retained your humanness. You had the right to appeal to the justice system if you were being mistreated or if the contract wasn't being handled properly. You could legally marry, which was not true for African American slaves, chattel slaves. They did marry, but it was never recognized by the law because they weren't recognized as human by the law. Your children did not become slaves upon being born, which was not the case with chattel slavery, and those are just a few examples.
Numbers that likely far exceeded the number of black slaves who arrived in the 1600s.
No, listen, between the importation of slaves legally ended in the early part of the 19th century, but about 400,000 Africans were brought or arrived in America as slaves. So it did not, in any way exceed the number that was brought. And you notice the difference is that by the time you get to 1860, there are 4 million enslaved African Americans. There are not those kinds of numbers of enslaved white people because it wasn't a situation where their descendants were born into slavery as well.
Mortality rates on the journey to the colonies often exceeded 20%. Many of them were legally classified as indentured servants under British law. Indentured servitude was, in theory, a contract entered between a poor person and a sponsor, in which the sponsor pays for the poor person's transit across the Atlantic in exchange for a set period of bondage. That, however, is the textbook definition. Reality was much harsher. In the early colonial period...
Let's qualify that. Sometimes it could be. Let's not say that that was how it, the reality was always that way.
There were not substantial differences between indentured servants and black slaves. Many were subjected to conditions of such brutality, duration, and heritability that historians increasingly regard slave as the more accurate term.
Yeah, but again, you'll hear the term all the time, chattel slavery. As I mentioned earlier, very key differences between the two.
There's no question that indentured servitude was slavery. Some indenture contracts literally use the term slave, and ads issued for runaway servants asked for them to be returned to their masters.
Right. So from the standpoint that you were in a contract that legally bound you to work for that person unpaid for room and board for a set period of time, yeah, from that standpoint, you could classify it as a form of slavery.
Some of them were held in bondage for life. Many of them were sent here against their will. At the outbreak of the...
But sent there against their will. They weren't kidnapped and forced into that situation. Most of them, there was some form of due process. And I'm not saying that the punishment fit the crime in any way, shape, or form, because punishment could be really, really harsh back then. But it didn't just randomly happen. Like you didn't have people being kidnapped on the streets of London and forced into indentured servanthood.
Revolution in 1776, more than 50,000 convicts were sent to the colonies as slave laborers.
Mostly Georgia.
There were all sorts of sources of white slavery. They were the convicts, the urban poor, political prisoners, thieves, prostitutes, vagrants, prisoners of war, anyone designated undesirable by the British government. In the winter of 1650, 150 ragged Scottish prisoners of war arrived at Massachusetts Bay Colony, where they were sold as indentured laborers for 20 to 30 pounds each.
Yeah, so you're talking about aftermath of things like the Battle of Culloden, right? So we're talking about the wars between that happened up in the Highlands in Scotland. It wasn't strictly between Scotland and England. It was more the government versus the forces that were fighting for the Jacobites.
And in colonial America, white and black slaves often bonded, according to NPR, which admits America's first slaves were white.
According to some African-American historians, there was no sign or little sign of racial tension between the English servants, which we reckon were slaves, and the African servants, who are also called servants. They were treated in much the same way for many decades. They complained together, they ran away together, they rebelled together.
George.
Yeah, and listen, here's the thing. I'm not the kind of person who, again, I don't have like strong feelings about Matt Walsh because I don't really watch him, so I don't know a lot of his politics. I'm just trying to come at this from as unbiased a view as I can. I know some of you have very strong feelings one way or another about him, and that probably colors how you're responding to this right now. And I know that I've looked at other videos like PragerU with Candace Owens, who has really gone off the rails the last couple of years. She has. And I found myself getting very violently reacting to that because I felt like it was trying to excuse chattel slavery by talking about, but look, other people were enslaved too. I don't initially get the impression that's what's happening here, and I know some of you would probably disagree with me on that. I just want to make sure that we frame this properly, as I said earlier, right? Everything he's saying is true, but keep the proper perspective. Don't allow your mind to believe that this was as bad as what happened to African Americans. Bad and bad. Definitely both bad. Not equally bad, not the same thing.
Washington himself had white slaves.
The beginning of your War of Independence, the Revolutionary War, there were ads in the Virginia Gazette for runaways, and I think that week there were something like 11 for white runaways and 3 for black runaways.
So I'm curious to know the details of the white runaways.
And 2 of the 11 white runaways were being advertised by George Washington.
Because I understand that the way the law worked at the time is that if you were born to an enslaved woman, you were considered enslaved yourself. And in many cases, you had, for example, great example from history is Sally Hemings, right? Sally Hemings is the daughter of a slave owner. Her father was the slave owner. Her mother was also the daughter of a slave owner. And so you had a situation where you had an enslaved woman who was Sally Hemings' mother, who was 50% black, 50% white, of European descent. Her child then was only 1/4 black, a quadroon as they called them, but still considered enslaved because she was born to an enslaved mother.
In early Virginia and Maryland, indentured servants, mostly English, Irish, and Scottish, did the same jobs that enslaved Africans would do in the 19th century, mostly tobacco farming. Conditions were so bad that 40 to 50% died before completing their terms.
But that's not necessary. I don't know the exact numbers, right? So I can't necessarily make a comparison. But I don't think that it's fair to imply from this that they died because of their indentured servitude. A lot of it is just because they were here and they were dealing with the conditions that a lot of people face. Look at the number of people who died the first year in Jamestown when they came over. It was an absurd number. It was way higher than 40 or 50%.
1671 report from Virginia Governor William Berkeley noted that the number of white slaves arriving vastly outnumbered black. Quote, "We suppose there come in of servants about 1,500, of which most are English, few Scotch, and fewer Irish, and not above 2 or 3 ships of Negroes in 7 years."
Well, that's because you're talking about Virginia, and the vast majority of enslaved Africans are coming through Charleston. They're coming further south, right? So if you were to ask the governor of South Carolina about the same thing, he would tell you that it was vastly more Africans coming in than Scots or Irish. It's just all about perspective and just having a big picture here.
He then went on to note that in the early years of the colony, 80% of servants did not survive the first year. But it wasn't just the slaves that were multiracial. It was the slaveholders, too.
Yeah.
At slavery's peak in 1860, thousands of slaves were owned by Choctaws, Cherokees, Creeks, and Chickasaw Indians. As Alan Taylor writes in the book American Colonies, the Iroquois were particularly brutal in this regard. In colonial America, the Iroquois would often subject captives, the ones they did not enslave, to ritualistic slaughter and cannibalism in which captives would be tied to the stake, stabbed, then prodded with hot pokers. Quote, "After the victim died, the women butchered his remains, cast them into cooking kettles, and served the stew to the entire village, so that all could be bound together in absorbing the captive's power."
Yeah, so you're dealing with a society that had those certain belief systems, and this isn't unique either. I mean, enslaving captives that you capture in times of war or in conflicts has been a part of all of human history.
At the outbreak of the Civil War, one of South Carolina's wealthiest citizens was a planter and slaveholder named William Ellison. Census records show that at the outset of the Civil War, he owned 63 slaves, making him one of the biggest slave owners in the region. During the Civil War, he and his sons made substantial donations to the Confederate government, but what makes Allison remarkable is that he was a black man. In fact, he was a freed slave whose former master had given him the business skills he needed to become a successful cotton gin manufacturer. He was such a prominent member of South Carolina society that the Charleston Mercury newspaper noted that he was a large slaveholder and is much respected throughout the district for his integrity and general good character.
Okay, so a little context to all of this. What he said is absolutely true. William Ellison did own slaves, but to tell the rest of the story with him, by the time you get close to the American Civil War, southern states, especially states like South Carolina, tightened their rules on the ability for free blacks to own property and things of that nature, and required them to have a white guardian, even if they were a free black. And that included William Ellison, who was required to have a white guardian. He eventually, when the secession happened, he ended up fleeing north, and he died in late 1861. There's debates about how many free blacks owned slaves, but the estimates I've read put it somewhere around 3,000 or 4,000. But in the vast majority of those cases, what you're dealing with are situations where you have maybe a free man who purchases his wife and his children out of slavery. But in order to keep them from being poached by someone or captured and re-enslaved, really as a way he sought to protect them, he would keep them legally enslaved on paper, so that they were legally his property and they couldn't be taken or anything like that. And so in many of those cases, and there's no way to document how many, it was really a situation where the person was just trying to protect the person. But were there free blacks who owned slaves and owned them as property? Absolutely, there were. But we're talking about a couple thousand compared to the roughly, I guess you would probably say 1,000 times that many. Probably 100 times that many of white slave owners, because you're dealing with 300,000 or 400,000 slave-owning families at that point, or slave owners, I should say.
When the American journalist and social critic Frederick Law Olmsted visited Mississippi in the early 1860s, he described meeting a black man who told him there were, quote, "many free Negroes all about this region. Some were very rich. He pointed out to me 3 plantations within 20 miles owned by colored men. They bought black folks, he said, and had servants of their own. They were very bad masters, very hard and cruel. If he had got to be sold, he would like best to have an American master buy him. The French, black Creole masters were very severe, and they whipped their N-words most to death. They whipped the flesh off.
Yeah.
In total, an estimated 3,000 blacks owned roughly 20,000 slaves in 1860. And in some cases, black slaveholders purchase relatives and spouses philanthropically,
Right.
rescuing them from other slaveholders. But according to the black historian Carter Godwin Woodson, they often simply bought and sold slaves like white traders.
Yeah, all of what he's saying is true, and I think I credit him for pointing that out about what happened in other cases. Some of you are going to say that I'm being too charitable, and I understand that, but I don't get the impression so far, at least in this video that I'm watching, which is only a 10-minute segment, obviously, that he's going out of his way to somehow try and justify chattel slavery of blacks by offering the rest of this story. I think this is a story that needs to be told. Just keep it in the larger context, right?
He even described one case in which, quote, a Negro shoemaker in Charleston, South Carolina purchased his wife for $700, but on finding her hard to please, he sold her
Wow.
a few months thereafter for $750.
Wow.
The 1860 census offers some context that's left out of the history textbooks.
Yeah, so the 1860 census is a great resource for these figures because there was not only the census, which counted, and when you're talking about the census, you're talking about it's counting free people, right? And that includes free people of color, who are often written that way, FPC. And a lot of my ancestors who were Melungeons, and that's a story I'll get into someday, were listed as free persons of color. But then they also did what was called the slave census. And then in that case, you would see they would be listed by the owner, and then it would list how many enslaved people were in that household. It didn't give names of individuals, which is very sad to me because I've got my own ancestral line. My great-great-grandmother was the daughter of an enslaved woman. But it basically lists the ages, the gender, and the racial makeup. So if they were mulatto or if they were black.
In this country. That year, there were 3,953,760 slaves and 487,970 total free colored population in the slave states in 1860.
Right.
The reality is that a very small percentage of freed blacks and American Indians owned slaves, but the same is true for white Americans. In the 1860 census, at the very height of slavery, there were 393,975 slave owners in the U.S. out of a total population of over 31 million.
Now, let's be fair when we're talking about this because we're talking about slave owners and then total population. The more accurate statistic would be to say, what is the percentage of households who have at least one enslaved person? And in the South, in the states that had legal slavery at this point, you're talking about roughly 1 in 4. So about 25% of Southern households had at least one enslaved person. But that doesn't mean that the other households weren't benefiting from that in some form, and many of them did.
That translates to about 1.2% of the population.
Not a fair statistic to compare it to. You know, you're talking about men, women, and children.
The vast majority of American whites never owned any slaves.
Right.
That's a critical point when in the context of modern calls for reparations. As a rule, black slaves in the American South had a life expectancy of 40 years and an annual mortality rate of 3 to 5%. Their odds of getting married, having children, attaining freedom were dramatically higher than slaves in the Caribbean, Brazil, East Africa, or, God forbid, Dahomey.
Now, I don't like this because the impression I get from this is the argument that, hey, they were better off to be slaves in America than they were to be in these other places. The bottom line is you were still somebody's property. And no matter how well you were treated, no matter how good your lifestyle was, no matter how well you were fed, no matter how what good status you had, in the end, you were somebody's property.
Slaves in the Caribbean lived in barracks. In the South, they had cabins. There's no doubt that being a slave was a bad life, but
Right.
if you were to be enslaved, it was better to be enslaved in the United States.
But it was better to be not enslaved. It was better to have your own freedom to choose your own life.
The clearest metric on this is that the U.S. slaves' population kept growing after slave imports were banned in 1808.
Well, of course it did, because once you ban the import of new enslaved people, now they have become a really wealthy commodity. Imagine if tomorrow they banned any new homes from being built in America. Suddenly, everybody who's already a homeowner has a very increased value commodity, because you can't build new ones, so the existing ones become of greater value. And in the case of enslaved people, the only way then to have new enslaved people is if you already own some and they have children who you can then sell, because you can't import new ones.
Unlike other parts of the Americas where deaths exceeded births, the U.S. ended up with nearly 4 million slaves.
Yeah. Well, you had every reason to basically breed your enslaved people, because you could create, imagine if you owned 2 cars, and by owning 2 cars, those cars could produce more cars. You would want that car to produce as many as possible.
In 1860, despite only
it's terrible to even say that, to compare an enslaved person to a car, but that's how it was seen, right? This was a wealthy commodity. You know, in many cases, in modern money, you're talking about $100,000 value for an enslaved person.
400,000 arrivals. Now, one reason for the better conditions could be incentives. With the import ban, slave owners' best source of slaves was high birth rates. Buying more was really expensive. Typical price for an able-bodied male field hand in New Orleans in 1860 was about $2,000. And if you track inflation based on the price of gold,
about $100,000.
That'd be over $100,000 today.
Yep.
For this reason, there are well-documented cases of slaveholders preferring to use less valuable lower-class whites for dangerous tasks.
Yeah, because a lower-class white is, that's in the case where you don't have access to have an enslaved person yourself. Don't get that to mean that the preference would be to have a paid white worker. You'd still prefer to have an enslaved person because they're free, right? And they're valuable. But if you didn't have the wealth to be able to purchase your own slaves, then you would hire low-class white workers. But again, I give him credit. He's acknowledging all of this. Okay, so I guess that's the end. Okay, so I actually expected that to get me worked up and somehow make me feel like it was trying to justify chattel slavery. I didn't get that impression. I know that this is just one segment of a much larger video. So that, I guess, my opinion could change based on what the other segments are like. But I do think that if we view everything he just said, as I've said before, in the context of the whole, then this is a fair thing to be talking about, as long as we don't use this to justify chattel slavery or to downplay it in some way. Because it was awful, it was evil, and it was way worse than anything that white enslaved people faced. Understanding that people who were enslaved in many cases by some of these Native American tribes, it was a pretty horrible existence too. So not discounting that either. So it gives us a fuller picture of the complicated nature of colonial society, in which a lot of pretty awful things went on. And a lot of people were the victims of those pretty awful things. Native Americans were very often the victims of white people, and white people were sometimes the victims of Native Americans. And Africans who were sold into slavery were very often sold into slavery by other Africans. The point is, every race, every culture, every religion, every society, every nation has its moments of great evil, has its moments that we are not proud of, that should not have happened, and that we can loudly proclaim as having been terrible. And it doesn't make us less patriotic. It doesn't make me less American to acknowledge that Americans have done awful things. So, off my soapbox now. Let me know your thoughts. Let's keep it civil. Keep it to the discussion of history. Don't turn it into personal attacks, things like that. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.